Welcome to Around the Shop with 360 Woodworking. Your hosts are Chuck Bender and Glen Huey. Each Saturday, tune in for the best in woodworking tips, techniques, and general shop fun. Now, here's the 360 guys, Chuck and Glen.
Today's topic is OG feet.
Oh, gee. How are we ever going to get anything out of this one?
Well, people use these a lot on furniture. I mean,
Sure.
It's a little different from a bracket foot because there's a few other steps to talk about, and that's kind of where we're going with this whole
Sure.
idea.
And that is it. We're trying to get to what the differences are in the way that you and I make them.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, I want to
what
start
that
out
really means.
talking about patterns.
Yep.
Because both of us make a pattern for our feet, especially, and that's one of the things. I am pro pattern on almost everything that I do because it's the idea that I can go back and reuse it again if I want to build the same project. But in this case, more than anything, you never lay out one foot.
Right.
You always have to lay out more feet than one. So at that point, if you're trying to work with a paper pattern, you're going to tear that pattern up by the time you get around.
And honestly, that's one of the things that, I've been pro hard patterns on these things for a long time, because when I started out at Irian, I just remember we had this little walkway that went down into the basement, and he had put up wooden pegs up around the top of the stairway there, and they were filled with every OG or straight bracket foot pattern from every antique and every reproduction piece they'd ever made.
No kidding.
I mean, it was just, anything that came in with a foot on it got a pattern taken, and I continued that when I went off on my own, and I've got, dozens and dozens and dozens of foot patterns.
How do you keep track of those? I mean, that's the kicker. It's like I could see having 1,000 different patterns, but I want the one off of this piece, and it's like, where in the world am I going to get it?
Well, one of the things that I took to doing was sort of stringing similar sizes together, and it really came in handy if your customer didn't want something specifically copied. Okay, if they wanted this, but they wanted to modify, if they wanted a tall chest, but they want to pick out their own little details, at that point you can look at it and say, okay, that's a semi-tall chest, a 6 or 7 inch foot on that thing is going to look perfect. So I go grab all the rings with the 6 and 7 inch feet on there, and now we're digging through all of that.
So it's interesting is I did something similar, but what I did is I took samples of the moldings of my projects and drilled holes and strung those all together. So whenever I built that piece, I go back and grab them all. But that's kind of getting off the topic.
Right. Well, that's kind of neat too, keeping the molding and the foot together because,
All right, so when we're talking patterns, we always lay our patterns out on something, either 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch, something along those lines. I've actually got a sample here. Yeah, well, that's what I had. So I have scrap around the shop. I'm going to set this up. But what I brought this out for, because I want to show and talk about, is obviously you can see the OG pattern on the front and this area in the back, but I have this point here, and this point is for to drill out that area for the spur. So my question to you is, do you drill out for the spurs when they have that kind of a deal, or do you just freehand cut them?
Well, that's a good question, and that sort of also pulls to, do OG feet always have that little spur? And you alluded to it, not all do, but I would say the vast majority have some form of spur. Some are more accentuated than others. If it's a really closed type of spur, I'll definitely drill it, but sometimes I don't. In fact, I have some feet that once I draw it out, I just head to the bandsaw and cut them, because setting up the drill press is just an extra step.
Yeah. So you are using a 3/16 or a 1/4 inch blade at your bandsaw, so you can get that tighter radius.
Yep. Almost always on my bandsaw, you'll find a 1/4 inch blade. I mean, the only time I ever change it is if I'm resawing, and now that I've got that cool Laguna 12, 1412, I don't need to switch out as often.
Absolutely. That's the beauty of having multiple machines in the shop.
Yep. So I don't drill everything, but some I do. And obviously you tend to drill them all because your patterns have the center point on them.
Well, generally I do, whether I need to or not, because I just find it easier to establish that point, drill it. It's just repetitive. Again, I don't have to think about it. I don't have to worry about spinning a nice deal. I don't have to go back and clean it up later because once it comes off the drill press, she's done.
Right. You're using a Forstner bit? Or
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely using a Forstner bit.
That way it leaves a nice clean surface.
Nice, clean surface.
Yeah, well, you know, and even coming off the bandsaw, and you can see I've got a couple here that, you know, I go back in with my spindle sander and hit all those areas. Yeah. Or actually, for the most part, when I throw it onto the case, I'll run over it with a filer or rasp and then hit it with some carving chisels because I want to leave some texture behind.
Yeah. I just antiques wise, they always had some texture, and that's one of the cool things. If you look at the bottom of an old chest or photos, you can see that handwork and stuff that's in there. So that's neat. So we've talked about this foot so far, but we haven't got down to how we actually make them. So let's let you go ahead and explain how you put these together and how you make them.
Well, it's pretty simple actually. I start out by cutting out the back pattern, you know, the spur area first on a flat piece, and you can see I've got the OG marked on that face.
Right.
So when I lay out so that I can wrap the molding around. I mean, you can see here I've got a 2 and a 2 marked on there. So when I laid out the feet for this particular piece, the 1s go together, 2s go together, 3 and 4 are my back feet.
Right.
So this way the grain wraps around. It's not super necessary, but it is kind of neat when it all comes together nicely inside the OG foot. I'll cut this out, miter up the pieces, glue them together so that I have a bracket foot.
Okay, let's not move so fast. Let's stop in there for a second because you glue them up. Now, this is an interesting spot for me. This is something I actually picked up from visiting you out in Pennsylvania when you were out there, is when I started, all of the feet that I did, bracket, OG bracket, doesn't matter. They were all splined together. And I had problems because if you think about a spline, okay, if you cut it for grain going back and forth across, well, if the bottom of the foot breaks, the spine breaks.
Right.
So then you think, turn that up straight up and down.
And now you're cross grain gluing.
And
you'll split the
and
spline.
You're going to split right at the corner. So I looked at it and I thought, for me, that was a perfect place for a piece of plywood. And then I spent a little time with you out in Pennsylvania. And the one thing that you told me that I think really stayed with me was I've looked at, and this was you, I've looked at a number of pieces and even some of the major big chests and stuff I've seen. I have not seen many that ever had splines in them.
Nope, very few. And in fact, there's that wacky rumor going around about people that full blind dovetail their OG feet and their straight bracket feet. I think in probably 10,000 chests that I've looked at, one.
Yeah. That was a guy that had way more time on his hands than he had sense. Yeah,
obviously pre-kid.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've tried that one time just to fool around with it. I've done blind dovetails, double blind dovetails, but when I look at them on a foot, it's like, no way, it's not worth that kind of time.
Right.
It's a way more investment than what it's needed for. Okay, so you're taking solid blocks, all right, and putting these together. You're gluing them up. So what you're doing is sizing the cut
moiter,
area,
right?
Coming back and then putting glue on and put them together. Now, you might think that is not going to be real good, but I tell you what, I have done tests around the shop where I've done that just to see. And if you let them dry thoroughly, you can just about play air hockey on the floor, or street hockey on the floor and knock those things around, and they are not going to come apart.
Okay. These 2 feet were actually glued up in a class probably 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And they kicked around the shop for several years. They made the trek from Pennsylvania to Cincinnati.
Yeah, and
no
they're still
problems,
there.
right?
Absolutely. So, the one thing you get out of this, if you don't get anything else, is you don't have to spline your feet. So let's go on now. So you've got your 2 faces put together,
right? So essentially, I have a straight bracket foot. So now I go to the bandsaw and I have a platform with a block on it. Something this small, I'd probably just take a square of plywood, some piece of scrap, and then run a piece of 2x2 up. Screw it to the plywood, and then that holds this up, and then I just bandsaw the thing out.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the one cut that's marked off is easy.
Right. Oh, and as soon as you make that first cut, what you see is the end grain on the other side.
Yeah.
So it's really simple, and that's sort of what you get. I mean, you can see it's got lots of bandsaw marks and stuff in there, but
those are easily cleaned up.
Sure. Take this thing and set it right down on the table of your spindle sander, and you can get the hollow right away.
Oh yeah, the hollows are super easy.
And then I go right to the vise on my bench, take a hand plane and hit the round part, and then I just buzz over the whole thing with a sander, and I'm done.
So how do you attack it when you get to a 7, 8, 9-inch foot? I mean, some of the Chester County pieces, seriously, some of the Chester County pieces have some pretty good sized feet, and I know you've built those.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Actually, I did a tall chest that had like 11 or 11.5-inch feet, and I just had a bigger platform with a 3x3 or a 4x4 screwed to it that was tall enough that I could. Obviously, your limitation is the throat on your bandsaw.
Yeah, which is right where I started and what happened to me. Because when I first started, I made, and I still do for the most part, make them this way, but I do all of my OG cutting off of the table saw.
As a stick.
Yeah, I get up a stick that's got at least 3 feet, and I lay them out so I have 3 facing right and 3 facing left. Perfect. Because you have to have 6, 2 pairs in the front, 2 odd ones on the side. And I'll run those just like I would set up to cut a cove molding, and I'll cut that cove in by setting fences down on my saw and pushing it across the blade. Now I did that because I started out with a 14-inch Delta bandsaw. It had 6 inches of clearance, and it's like I couldn't do anything. I mean, if I was working on a 3-inch foot, woohoo, I could do it.
The only thing you could do were tall case clock feet.
Yeah,
and some of those boxes. Not so much.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, so I started out that whole way of doing it, and it's funny is, and I find myself at least doing it is when I develop a pattern, a way I work, and method of work, I generally stick to it. Now today, I got a bandsaw. I put a riser block on my Delta years and years ago, but I still find myself for the most part laying them out and knocking them off on the table saw as opposed to putting them together. And it poses a lot of problems. And the big area for me problem-wise was when you go to glue up. Because as you're gluing up 2 flat blocks, it's easy to put clamps on those things. When you introduce that OG, now all of a sudden your clamps are moving different directions and things like that. So again, that was a problem I had when I was splining. When you quit splining, now you don't have to worry so much about clamping them up. As long as you got a good 45 and you glue them up, you can rub that joint together, set them around, let them dry. Yep. And so a lot of problems come out.
See, and a lot of people think you can only rub joint stuff with hot hide glue or something like that. These were glued together with Elmer's Glue All white glue.
Oh, white glue. Nasty stuff. No, it's schoolhouse glue.
No. You don't go for their school glue.
Oh, okay. All right. So you're talking about their white PVA type stuff. Yeah. Yep. So I think it's interesting that coming at it from a couple different directions.
Sure. One of the things that I always found to be a problem when you make the OG first is how do you lay the flat pattern on here with that shaped surface, and how do you get it cut out?
Well, what I generally do is, because I'm taking these off of the table saw, I'm laying that flat pattern out on the back side.
Oh.
And then once I get it all finished up, I'm taking them over to the saw and I'm mitering the cut and going from there.
Right. So I guess the only thing you have to worry about is like when you drill through, are you drilling from the back?
Yeah, and that's
you might get a little tear out.
And that's one of the things you really got to look at. You got to look at as you're coming through there. As I get down to a certain spot, I'll start slowing my rate of descent so it gets a nicer, cleaner cut.
Right.
Otherwise, if you hog through that thing, you are going to get blowout huge on the front. And
you'll have a lot less OG to your foot.
Yeah, no, it'll be a lot less. Oh, gee. So, yeah, I mean, it doesn't work real well when you do it that way. Another thing that I want to talk about, and I know it's key with you, and I, again, I didn't start off working with a shop. I started off working on my own, and I learned all my mistakes, if you will, by myself. So when you finally start working with somebody or watching how things are done, you start seeing stuff different. You, at times as we're talking about this, mentioned foot facings. And I find this really interesting because for me, it was the foot. I mean, I put that foot down on the bottom of my chest and, there you go. And when I'm doing OG feet, I'm using 8/4 stock. And that way I can get not only a nice bend in it for, nice OG, if you will, so it looks bold, but I'm also leaving enough material there that it can support my chest.
Well, and if you look at this, I mean, you've got a fairly nice curve to it.
Yeah.
And, I mean, you've got plenty of meat left on there. And
so what did this start out as? This was a piece of 7/8 or 1 inch.
7/8.
7/8.
And that's generally what I make them, unless they're really tall. I might go to 1.25 inches.
So you're taking 3/8 away, leaving about a 1/2 inch, a strong 1/2 inch back in there.
Sure.
Right.
And you'll find that's the way they were done a lot. And what you find out is they took that corner post, the block that goes in behind, and they extended it down beyond the foot. Or if you look at some of the Philadelphia feet, they've got those thumbnailed pads that go on the bottom. And you know that those things end up the corner block runs right to that pad, and that way the weight is really being carried by that corner block, and then you throw all the other blocking in there, and you've got to work pretty hard to knock a bracket foot off a chest or something. So
and we should go ahead and grab a pair over, and we should talk about where the block placement is. I mean, I think it's interesting is if you're not familiar with this, obviously we just talked about the one that's in the corner, but there's also one that goes across both of these wings, if you will.
Sure.
And that's again holding power.
Well, it's essentially doing what your piece of 8/4 does. You've extended this top surface back in further, so you're getting more glue surface to the bottom of the chest.
Right.
Or you put a frame around
there.
Well,
to some I do and some I don't. Yeah.
Okay. But essentially, if you think about it, if I glue a block here, now that's just extended this surface out another 7/8 of an inch or whatever the width of that block is. Yeah. So now you've got, you know, 1.5 inches or 2 inches of material that are making contact with the bottom of that chest. That's a pretty strong glue joint.
So do you put your blocks onto your feet and then use that to attach to the chest, or do you put the foot to the chest and then use the glue block in between?
I put the foot facings onto the base molding, because realistically that's what they are. They're an extension of that molding. And then I put in the corner blocks, the corner posts that actually do the support on the chest. Right. And then I turn around and throw in the other blocks to keep them attached to everything.
I see. So that's a process you go through.
Right.
See, with mine, again, looking at the 8/4, I always had enough meat there that they just went right to whatever the surface. If I was going to a frame or if I was going to the bottom of the
so
case.
you didn't block anything?
Oh no, I blocked them, but I always blocked them after they were attached.
Right, and
then I just went in with the rub joint. And, stuck them in
and
there.
that's what I'm doing. It's just rub jointing them in there.
Cool. All right. So in summing up what we talked about today, talk about patterns. We both do patterns because they're repeatable, reusable, and in this instance, because you're making 6 feet, you need to have that pattern.
At a minimum, you're making 6 faces.
Right. We talked about ways to cut. Primarily, I'm using my table saw because that's the way I learned. And you're at a bandsaw, setting the piece up on a stand. Nice way to do that. No splines. I went years for splines, but no splines. We were both on the same page now.
Yep.
And as far as drilling out the spur area, I do it on most of mine. You do it on some you cut. Pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
So if you watch this podcast, you notice that we have 360 woodworking coffee mugs. Send us a question. If we read your question on the air, we'll send you a coffee mug for free. And if you don't want to wait that long, we have them in our store, so check that out as well. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's about it. We'll see you next week.
Join the 360 guys next week and every Saturday for more woodworking talk from around the shop.